Does the Indian team really mistreat Sanju Samson? The case with Sanju Samson has always been interesting. Since his debut for the Indian team in 2014 until now, there's a lot of talk about if Sanju Samson's getting enough chances or not. And finally, when Sanju Samson establishes himself as a T20 opener for the Indian team, he gets removed from the opening slot for someone who wasn't even in the T20 side for the longest time. And when the ODS squad to Australia was announced and a lot of people thought Sanju Samson would be the backup wicketkeeper, he didn't find his place in that squad too. And this is when a lot of people start talking about, does he get mistreated? Is he not treated properly? And if he deserves to be treated like this. Now, before we get into all of this and talk about his numbers and his journey and how he made his debut for the Indian team to begin with, hit that subscribe button and here's a promo from our membership. In the last 15 years, this 5 years have been the toughest period to bat in India.
Yeah, just the New Zealand series is where the New Zealand batters averaged more against spin than us.
The first time in 12 years where an opposition batters have outperformed the Indian batters playing against spin.
It's just tougher for a batter because there are bigger zones outside that Goldilocks zone that are now tougher to bat against. You just don't know what to line up for.
But it just goes to show that playing field has decreased for the Indian team in terms of having an advantage.
I think they should just play normal good cricketing wickets and they'll win matches. They have the pedigree.
First of all, let's go all the way back to 2014. This was the very first time when Sanju Samson was named in the India squad. He was just a 19-year-old coming off from an Under-19 World Cup, an India A quadrangle series, and a very impressive IPL. Sanju Samson was named in the white ball series against England but did not get a game. But let's look at what he had done so far to even get his name there in the first place. In the Under-19 World Cup in that year, Sanju Samson was the highest scorer for the Indian team, where in 6 matches he averaged 44.5 and struck at 96.7. He also had most 50 plus score for the Indian team, having 350s under his name. And in 2014, when there were players like Rahane and Shane Watson in the Rajasthan Royals, Sanju Samson was yet again the highest scorer for the team in the IPL, where in 13 matches he scored 339 runs with a mere average of 26 and a strike rate of 124. But again, for a 19-year-old, and especially at that time, all of these numbers were impressive. Now later that year, Sanju Samson was also part of the India A squad that went to Australia to play a quadrangular series. He kicked off the series by scoring 81 against Australia A, and he was a man to count on under pressure because he walked into bat when India A was 70 for 4 and then 84 for 6, chasing 253. And the only reason he couldn't go through with that chase is because he had no more batting partners with him. But later on in that tournament, that wasn't a problem for him because in 2 successive chases, he had scores of 55 not out and 49 not out. So you knew he was a man who could score runs. He was a man who could score under pressure and also in big matches, because we had seen that in the World Cup, we had seen that in the IPL, and now in the series in Australia. He was the highest scorer for the Indian team, where in 7 matches he scored 244 runs with an average of 81 and a strike rate of 86. Something of course to keep in mind that he had 4 not outs in 7 innings, also why his average is so high. The 2015 IPL wasn't the most impressive, but because Sanju Samson's name was around the horizon and the fact that he was called up for the Indian team in 2014, this was a tour of Zimbabwe where the Indian team traveled to Zimbabwe. Sanju Samson's name was not originally in the squad, but few days before the T20 series had started, Ambati Raidu got injured, because of which Sanju Samson was asked to fly to Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, it wasn't a dream start for Samson. He got a game in the second T20, which was also the last T20 match of the series. He walked into bat at 69 for 5, already again under pressure, chasing 146. After everything that I would have told you, you would think that a man under pressure and the man who has chased a lot of games in Australia for India A could possibly do it, but unfortunately in his debut match for India, he just couldn't. He got out scoring 19 and 24 balls, and India unfortunately lost that match by 10 runs. And now here's the kicker, and this is what frustrated a lot of people over the years since Sanju Samson made his debut for the Indian team, because after his first debut game for India against Zimbabwe, the next time he plays for India is 5 years later in 2020. But let's hold on before we get there, because there are a lot of things to talk about in between. Now, there are a lot of things that frustrate the Indian fans, especially Sanju Samson's fans, that want him and root for him to play for the Indian team. And one of them is his consistency. A lot of people say that he's not consistent enough, but even when he's consistent, he's not consistent throughout, especially in the IPL, where a lot of people talk about he performs the first half but doesn't necessarily perform the second half. He doesn't take his consistency through the tournament. And so this is what we have done. We are going to look at the IPL from 2015 to 2019 because 2015 was the year he debuted for the Indian team and 2020 was the year where he returned. So we're going to look at the IPL in between and we're going to divide each season into two, the first half and the second half, to see if this even holds true to begin with. Like I said before, the 2015 IPL was a mediocre one. He didn't score a lot of runs. In the first half where he mostly opened, in the second half he was spread all over the batting lineup. By the end of the season, he only averaged 20 with a strike rate of 125. Ironically, if you look at this IPL, he only improved by the season. So his second half average is 27, whereas his first half average is 13. Even the 2016 season wasn't all that impressive because by the end of the season, he had only scored 291. He was yet to breach the 300 run mark. But even in this, he was someone who would improve by the season because by the end of that season, he had an average of 26. But in the first half, he had an average of 25. And in the second half, he had an average of 27. Not only that, his strike rate improved from 107 to 117. Of course, objectively, if you look at these numbers, they aren't impressive at all. But you got to realize that he's just a 21-year-old finding his mark in the IPL. It's the 2017 season that almost was a breakout season for him because he was close to scoring 400 runs. By the end of that season, he scored 386 runs with an average of 27 and a strike rate of 141. He really was impressive in terms of his strike rate. Not only that, he was very, very impressive in the first half of the IPL. And this is where the narrative even begins. Because in the first half of the IPL, in 7 innings, he scored 284 runs with an average of 40 and a strike rate of 145. And this average of 40 comes with no not outs. For someone who's in his early 20s, midway through to 2017 season, he was the 7th highest run scorer. But this is where the problem begins because in the second half of the 2017 season, he only averaged 14 with a strike rate of 130.7. But for someone very young, by the end of the 2017 season, he was the 11th highest run scorer in the 2017 IPL edition. But this trend continued even in the 2018 IPL season, where by the time you were halfway through in the 18 edition, he had a fantastic season, where in 7 matches, he averaged 46 and had a strike rate of 147. He had also scored 279 runs. Before we go on to the second half, this is the first season where he scored more than 400 runs. He has scored 441 by the end of that season. Right, so he scores 279 runs in the first half. But what about the second? The man across 8 matches struggles to score even 200 runs. From averaging 46 in the first half, he only averaged 20. And his strike rate had significantly come down to 123. For someone who was the 5th highest scorer in that edition halfway through, by the end of that season, he was the 15th highest scorer. Again, arguably impressive for someone very young, but now he's already settled into the IPL because he's had so many seasons until now. And surprise, surprise, the trend continues even in 2019, where in the first half, he had an average of 40 and in the second half, he had an average of 27. Not as low as a lot of people might expect, but this was another season where he didn't go past 400 runs. And I say 400 runs because something you got to remember, because there are a lot of young batters out there and still are in the IPL who are able to cross that 400 run mark consistently. And Sanju Samson at that point wasn't able to do that. His strike rate, however, had gone up from the first half to the second half because in the first half he had a strike rate of 142 and in the second he had a strike rate of 158. And in the second half, this mostly came while he opened and batted number 3. But again, by the end of that season, he was the 25th highest scorer. He hadn't really put his foot down in the IPL, and so the narrative of him being consistent in the first half and dropping down in the second half, according to the numbers at least, holds true. So now let's look at it overall, right? From 2015 to 2019, he has scored 1,664 runs with a decent average of 28 and a strike rate of 133. They're not outstanding by any means. And when you look at the first half average and the second half average overall, he had an average of 33 and a strike rate of 133 in the first half of the IPL in all of these seasons. And in the second half, he had an average of 23 and a strike rate of 134. Look at these numbers and you tell me, was it really a surprise that he didn't make it to the Indian team? But then you might argue, saying it's not only the IPL, it's also the Syed Mushtaq Ali, it's also the Vijay Hazare, it's a lot of domestic cricket that also should have counted. Until 2020, his Syed Mushtaq Ali numbers were even worse because he only averaged 26 with a strike rate of 120. But as a designated wicketkeeper, until now, he was the 10th highest run scorer. But of course, he did have some standout years in the Syed Mushtaq Ali, especially the 2016 and the 2018 season, where in the 2016 season, he averaged 33 with a strike rate of 123. He was the 10th highest scorer in that season, but not the highest scorer from Kerala. He was the 2nd highest scorer, in fact. But the 2018 season was really a standout one because he averaged 43 with a strike rate of 143. Now I know we are going through a lot of averages and strike rates again and again. There's a lot of numbers, but this is to just make you guys understand that he wasn't really a standout player. A lot of people talked about Sanju Samson, the potential player. A lot of people talked about Sanju Samson, the talented player. But once he played for the Indian team in 2015 and started playing the IPL regularly, apart from potential and talent, nothing really stood out. Until two things happened. One, Rishabh Pant was not finding his feet for the Indian team in the T20 format. He was just not good enough. He wasn't able to replicate the Rishabh Pant that he was in the IPL, and that got him to the stage. And so a lot of people started talking about, if Rishabh Pant can continuously get a go, why can't Sanju Samson? Because if the argument is Rishabh Pant has the potential but doesn't necessarily have the numbers, why can't you then try Sanju Samson, who also has the potential, who has played for the Indian team and has been playing IPL for so many years? But there was another reason to this, and this was the Vijay Hazare Trophy in 2019, where Sanju Samson scored a 212 not out in the 50 over format. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean to degrade him at all. Scoring 200 plus in a 50 over format in a tournament is fantastic in itself. But you would also assume by the end of that tournament that he might be the highest scorer, at least for his state. But he wasn't. But that being said, his numbers overall were still impressive because by the end of that tournament, he scored 410 runs across 8 matches, averaging 58 and had a strike rate of 125. Of course, within his team, he had the highest strike rate. But this was the problem. He only had 100 and 150 across 8 innings. I say only because this was the reason for why he wasn't even the highest scorer in his state. The fact that he had a 200 plus but wasn't the highest scorer says something about his consistency. And this was always the excuse that the selectors used to not select him for the Indian team. And that was he just wasn't consistent enough. And you can't even blame him because if you look at all of these numbers, it just goes to show that he wasn't consistent back then. But right, the selectors had to give up on Rishabh Pant at some point. They had to give in to the pressure of selecting Sanju Samson. And that's exactly what happened in 2020, where he was selected to play the third T20 against Sri Lanka, where Sanju Samson replaced Rishabh Pant in the T20 squad. And at that point, Sanju Samson had unfortunately also made an unnecessary record because since his debut in 2015 until his second game in 2020, Sanju Samson missed 73 T20Is in between. And this at that time was a record number in between 2 appearances on the T20I format for the Indian team. Now, a lot of fans were delighted. A lot of people were happy that Sanju Samson was finally picked for the Indian team, and not just in the squad but in the 11. But unfortunately, he disappointed once again. A lot of people might even remember this. He faced 2 deliveries where in the first ball he hit a 6 and he got out the second ball. But that being said, that wasn't it for Sanju Samson. He didn't have to wait 5 more years because after that, India were going to play New Zealand in a couple of T20 matches, wherein Sanju Samson got a chance once again. Now, this was a 5-match T20 series where he wasn't, of course, selected in the first 3 games, but in the 4th game, Rohit Sharma was rested and Sanju Samson was asked to open, where he just scored 8 runs. Once again, he hit a 6 and got out. And then in the 5th game, Virat Kohli this time, who was the captain at the time, was rested, but Sanju Samson was yet again asked to open, whereas Rohit Sharma batted at number 3. But again, doesn't even get a start because he gets out for just 2. And that's when the IPL of 2020 comes along. For someone who was consistently picked for the Indian team, at least given a handful of chances, after so many years, you would hope that this man has a good IPL. But this was the IPL where he showed his sheer power. He of course didn't get past 400 runs, so in terms of runs and averages, he wasn't standing above the rest, but in terms of strike rate, he really stood out. By the end of that IPL, he had an average of 28 and a strike rate of 158, and lo and behold, when you look at his first half and second half, his averages didn't stand out, but they were consistent because in the first half, he averaged 28, and in the second half too, he averaged 28. If anything, his strike rate had come down a little bit, but they weren't by any means low because he had a strike rate of 164 in the first half, and in the second half, he had a strike rate of 153. Right, so this would have been one of those IPL where he didn't necessarily score a lot of runs, but he showed that he could really strike the ball. And after the IPL, Sanju Samson was picked for a T20I series in Australia against Australia. This was a T20 squad where Rishabh Pant was not part of the squad. KL Rahul and Sanju Samson were the wicketkeepers at that time. Right, so Sanju Samson has a mediocre IPL season, gets picked to play against against Australia, you would then hope this is when he stamps his authority. But like I keep talking about in this video, unfortunately, he doesn't do that yet again. He gets 3 games, bats at number 4 in all 3 games, has a score of 23, 15 and 10. By the end of that series, he has an average of 16. Of course, the strike rate of 141. But of course, if you're averaging only 16 as a number 4 batter, you've got real problems. A couple of months after that, India were playing a T20 series against England in 2021, early 2021 in fact, where Sanju Samson did not find his place in the squad. He was dropped yet again, and this wasn't a surprise because he wasn't performing at all. Not only that, the Vijay Hazare Trophy was taking place in India. He wasn't having the best of runs, but he also found himself getting injured. So in this India squad that was going to play England, Rishabh Pant was once again selected, and there was a young man named Ishan Kishan who replaced Sanju Samson as the wicketkeeper. And that's when we have the IPL of 2021, where again you would hope that Sanju Samson stands out, where he scores runs, where he makes his mark to hopefully be in the World Cup squad. A reminder to you guys, the 2021 IPL season was played in 2 halves, the first half in India and the second half in Dubai, and the second half was also played a few months later. Fingers crossed, Sanju Samson had a fantastic first half back at home, because in 7 matches he averaged 46 and had a strike rate of 145. He was also the 5th highest scorer midway through, and that's when the IPL took a break because of everything that was going around. But this was great because Sanju Samson had scored and was picked not only in the T20 squad but also in the ODI squad that was going to play Sri Lanka. And yes, Sanju Samson also made his ODI debut this time, where he scored 46 of 46 batting at number 3, threw his wicket away, and a lot of people talked about how an elegant 46 isn't just good enough in the ODI format. And a lot of people were just unnecessarily harsh because if you look at the scorecard, he was the 2nd highest run scorer. So he did what he could, especially because it was his first game in the ODI format for the Indian team. 2 days later, he plays the T20I series against Sri Lanka, where he gets all 3 games. This is it. He's had a fantastic IPL. He's had a good start in his ODI career. You can only hope that he emulates all of this in the T20I series. But unfortunately, it's the same old story. By the end of the 3 matches, he only averaged 11 and had a strike rate of 94. But again, there's some hope because the second half of the IPL starts again and he finds himself playing for Rajasthan Royals. He has an average of 34 and a strike rate of 126. The 9th highest scorer in the second half, still finds himself in the top 10. So he might just potentially find a place in the T20 squad. But there was a narrative going around. It's the fact that he might just do all of this in the IPL. He anyways doesn't stand out as such, but he may not be at the level of international cricket because every time he's been given a chance, he just hasn't scored, at least in the T20 format. And something to remember that the World Cup that year was going to happen in Dubai, and there were 2 other contenders as a wicketkeeper with Sanju Samson. That was Rishabh Pant, who had similar numbers, who until that point was preferred over Sanju Samson if the numbers were similar, also because he was a left-handed batter, and the other option was Ishan Kishan, who averaged 52 and had a strike rate of 191 in the second half of the IPL, which was in Dubai. And so naturally, Rishabh Pant and Ishan Kishan were picked ahead of Sanju Samson for that World Cup. Now, of course, if we go back to the World Cup and think about it, India had a horrible run. And after that series, we played New Zealand and West Indies, where these 2 wicketkeepers were tried and tested again. Rishabh Pant was eventually dropped once again from the T20 format, whereas Ishan Kishan was continued to be picked. But after the New Zealand and the West Indies series after the World Cup, Sanju Samson was yet again picked to play against Sri Lanka, where in one of the games he batted number 4 and in the other game he opened because Ishan Kishan suffered an injury. The 2 innings that he got, he averaged only 28 but had a strike rate of 154. But again, was nowhere close to cementing his place because there were a lot of other batters in the squad who not only outperformed him but also had a better strike rate. And then we have the IPL of 2022, where you would again hope as a Sanju Samson fan that he performs. He has performed in the last couple of seasons, I'll cut him some slack, but he hasn't by any means been on top of the mark. He could have potentially been picked in the 2021 World Cup, but he was hard done by, especially in that season in Dubai. But here's the thing, right? You would just hope he continues to perform because a lot of batters you see in the IPL who continue to perform season after season and then get picked for the Indian team. And in the 2022 IPL, he had an average of 28 and struck at 146. This was a season where he breached 400 run mark, and some might even say he had a good IPL. Now this is where we'll take a step back from going season after season or match by match, and we will look at a couple of things. From the 2022 IPL until he started opening for the Indian team after the T20 World Cup in 2024, a lot of interesting things happened. There were 2 IPLs in between where he really did perform and put his foot down. But not just that, he was in and out of the squad. The Indian team tried so many other wicket keepers from the 2022 IPL until he opened for the Indian team after the World Cup. In between, he played 17 matches for India, where he only averaged 24 and struck at 138. And in between all of this, they tried so many wicket keepers with the likes of Dhruv Jurel, Dinesh Karthik once again, Jitesh Sharma, Rishabh Pant, Ishan Kishan, and Sanju Samson. A total of 6 wicket keepers were tried. And no one really stood out. If anything, Rishabh Pant and Sanju Samson had similar numbers. Now, like I said before, if they had similar numbers, the selectors had the tendency to go with Rishabh Pant. Not only because of his reputation in the red ball format, but because he was also a left-handed batter. If you look at the cumulative numbers of Sanju Samson's 2023 and 2024 IPLs, this was by far, at least cumulatively, the best. He scored close to 900 runs across 2 seasons, with an average of 38 and a strike rate of 153. Again, are these the most mind-boggling numbers? Not really. But in terms of averages and strike rates, at least it's better than what he's been doing season after season so far. I did talk about how Sanju Samson made his ODI debut in 2021, but he didn't get another ODI until 2022. Sanju Samson's ODI career is another story on its own, but we are not going to go into it in detail. But if you look at his ODI career in 16 matches, he has an average of 56, has a strike rate of 99 with 103 50s. And not only that, but he also has 5 not outs in between all of this. So then when you look at his numbers, you would assume that there's nothing wrong with his ODI numbers. If anything, he should be selected time and again and consistently because he's shown that he can consistently perform. But here's what's fascinating. If you look at his ODI innings and the teams he's played against Zimbabwe, he's played 2 series against South Africa, he's played against New Zealand multiple times against West Indies. Yet, across these 16 games, he hasn't played with Rohit Sharma or Virat Kohli in the ODI squad. Now, I say these 2 names because you know that if these 2 guys are missing from the squad, or at least one of them, you know it's not the main squad that's going to play against these sides. And that's exactly what it is. Sanju Samson always found himself in the ODI squad when it wasn't the main side. He was always a substitute for someone. And by the time the main squad was announced, he was always dropped for someone else. And so even though Sanju Samson kept performing, he never really cemented his place because he was always looked at someone who would go and fill in a space. What's fascinating to me is that Agarkar in the post-match press conference, when asked about the backup wicketkeeper in the ODI format, Agarkar said that Sanju Samson is an opener, not a middle order batter, and we need Dhruv Jurel as a middle order batter. As much as it makes us very, very happy that Dhruv Jurel is progressing and is in the ODI format, that's just a horrible excuse. Because Sanju Samson in the ODI format has predominantly batted in the middle order. He's batted between the positions 4 and 7 11 times, with an average of 57 and a strike rate of 104. He also has 3 50s under his name, but of course, a lot of people also remember that the last time he played an ODI match for India was against South Africa, where he scored 108. Imagine scoring 100 and then getting dropped. Imagine having these numbers and then getting dropped. So as much as I keep talking about how he hasn't performed in the IPL necessarily, or hasn't stood out in the IPL and hasn't put his foot down in the T20 format, when given a chance in the ODI format, he's done what he could. Sometimes with Sanju Samson, it also feels like the expectation is so high that if he can't match it and just does decently well, that's just not good enough. But this is where we come back to when Sanju Samson started opening for the Indian team after the T20 World Cup, where in 14 matches he averaged 37 and had a strike rate of 183. He had 312 of the occasions that he got to bat. This just says that this man had finally found his spot in the T20 format. After all of these years, he found his place in the T20 format. Yes, there was a discussion on his weakness on the short ball. That's a whole other video in itself. But he had finally made his mark. He had finally found his spot in the Indian team, which should have been fixed. But this is where, after all of these series and after all of these matches, come the Asia Cup, we have Shubman Gill going to open. We had Sanju Samson batting all over the middle order, where by the end of the Asia Cup, he did have an average of 33 and a strike rate of 124. Not the worst Asia Cup, not the best either, because he didn't look at his best. But what do you expect? For someone who was tried and tested for so many years in the IPL, for someone who you didn't pick for so many years for the Indian team, when you finally pick him, when he finally finds his spot, you take it away from him. According to us, was he lucky to play for the Indian team? I would say yes, for the longest time he was lucky. Even in the early 2020s, he was lucky to play for the Indian team because his numbers by no means were impressive. But with Rishabh Pant, Ishan Kishan and all of the wicketkeepers struggling, you had to give someone a try, and they continued to give Sanju Samson a try, who again didn't make his mark. But if you're so persistent with him and then you pick him once again and then he finally performs in a spot for the Indian team, why take that away from him? And for all that excuses that Agarkar gave about how he can't bat in the middle order in the ODI format, that's simply not true. If he can do that in the T20 format, if he's already done that in the ODI format and has been successful, he can simply do that once again in the format. So here's where I conclude this video. Was Sanju Samson lucky? To some extent, yes, but a lot of people have to be lucky to some extent to perform for the Indian team. He was lucky a lot of times to be picked, and the frustration of how every time he's picked for the Indian team he doesn't perform narrative is true, because he hardly ever performed until he finally found his place. And when he finally found his place in the Indian team, that was robbed from him. This has been a video on Sanju Samson's career so far, what has been an interesting journey already, and what hopefully continues to be an interesting one. Like, share and subscribe, all that good stuff. All of our links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.